writing the rules on how to protect women from predators was, in fact, the most terrifying predator of all. In 1970s Seattle, a crisis hotline was staffed by a young man so trusted, so empathetic, that his colleagues called him wonderful on the phone. He was a charismatic, rising star in politics and law man who literally co-authored a public pamphlet on rape prevention. But while that reassuring voice was counseling the vulnerable, a dark and calculating mind was using that same charm as a weapon on one side of the city. He was the solution. On the other, he was the monster everyone was warned about. This is the story of the ultimate mask of sanity, a fateful deception that fooled a nation and left a trail of devastation in its wake. How did America's charming boy next door become its most infamous nightmare? Welcome, dear friends, to Deadly Whispers. Tonight, we're stepping into the quiet corners of a story that truly captured my attention, and I hope it will yours too. So, dim the lights, find your calm, and let's gently explore the shadows of the Ted Bundy case. But before we do, a quick thought for our future stories. Suggest a city in the comments below, okay? And I will look for its untold stories to share. And as always, your quiet support through a like and a subscribe truly inspires the continuation of this space, helping us uncover more shadows together. Now, let's begin to understand the monster, okay? You first have to understand the man, and to understand the man, okay, you have to peel back a lifetime of secrets, beginning with the very first one, his own identity. Theodore Robert Caldwell was born on November 24th, 1946, into the hushed, judgmental world of post-war America. His birth certificate listed his father as unknown, a stain of shame for his 22-year-old unmarried mother, Louise. To hide this truth in an era of perfect family facades, a lie was constructed. Ted was raised by his grandparents, told they were his parents, and that Louise was his older sister. He grew up in a house of whispers, spelt on a foundation of deception. The air in that home was further poisoned by his grandfather, Samuel Caldwell, a man described as a tyrannical figure prone to explosive rage, physically abusive to his family, and even the dog. It was in this crucible of secrets and silent violence that the first dark glimmers of the man Ted would become began to surface. The stories are the stuff of nightmares. His Aunt Julia, waking from a nap to find her 3-year-old nephew standing silently beside her bed, smiling, having arranged a perimeter of gleaming kitchen knives around her sleeping body in the woods. He developed private rituals of cruelty, dissecting mice, catching and killing frogs. As a teen, this darkness evolved. He became a voyeur, a peeping Tom, finding a thrill in violating the private worlds of others from a distance. He stole things, not for their value, but for the rush of getting away with it. The boy everyone saw was quiet, intelligent, and socially awkward. But the boy who existed in the shadows was learning, practicing, and nurturing a profound coldness that no one could see. His young adulthood was a masterclass in calculated transformation. This was when he began constructing the mask, the charismatic persona that would become his greatest weapon. At the University of Washington, he met Diane Edwards, a wealthy, sophisticated young woman from California. To Ted, she wasn't just a girlfriend. She was an aspiration, his ticket to the high life, everything he believed he was not. He was devastated when she ended their relationship, seeing him as immature and lacking ambition. That rejection didn't just break his heart, it ignited a furnace of vengeful ambition. He reinvented himself, becoming a star psychology student, a confident volunteer in state politics, earning a letter of recommendation from the governor. He became the man he thought she wanted. Years later, in 1973, he sought her out. He turned on the charm he had perfected and swept her off her feet all over again. He convinced her that he was the successful, driven man she was destined to marry. And then, at the peak of her affection, in January 1974, he delivered the killing blow when she called. Desperate to know why he'd suddenly gone cold, he responded with chilling indifference. "I have no idea what you mean," he told her, before slamming down the phone. This wasn't a breakup, it was a rehearsal. It was an execution of a different kind, an act of pure emotional sadism that gave him the sense of power and control he craved. In perfecting his revenge on Diane, he had found his type, not just physically attractive students with long, dark hair parted in the middle, but women who represented what he once coveted and now sought to possess and utterly destroy. All the while, he was living another life with another woman, Elizabeth Klopfer, single mother he'd met in 1969. To her and her young daughter, he was the picture of a loving partner, warm, kind, and stable. Their life together was his alibi, the cornerstone of his mask. It allowed him to project an image of normalcy that was so convincing. It would take the disappearance of dozens of women for even the person closest to him to begin to see the truth. By 1974, that truth began to write itself in blood across the Pacific Northwest. A shadow fell over the college campuses of Washington and Oregon, a region once defined by its trusting, open-hearted nature. Suddenly, young women, bright, vibrant, full of life, were vanishing. First, Linda Ann Healy, a University of Washington student who broadcasted the morning ski report. Investigators walked into her apartment to find a chillingly quiet scene. Her bed had been neatly made, but when they pulled back the covers, they found the mattress underneath stained with blood. Her nightgown was laid out nearby. It was a scene of terrifying precision, a killer who took the time to erase his presence, to tidy up after an act of unspeakable violence. Then Donna Manson vanished from her campus, then Susan Roncourt, then Roberta Parks. The names became a horrifying litany, a drumbeat of fear that echoed across the region. For detectives, it was a waking nightmare. There were no bodies, no ransom notes, no signs of struggle, just a series of inexplicable black holes where young women used to be. The disappearances were linked only by a phantom, a handsome, charming young man, sometimes with his arm in a sling, asking for help, always driving a tan Volkswagen Beetle. The police had a name for this phantom, a name born from witness descriptions. They were hunting for Ted, the brazenness, escalated. On June 11th, Georgianne Hawkins, a bright student and sorority sister, vanished from a brightly lit alley just 50 feet from the safety of her sorority house. But the chilling peak came 1 month later on a beautiful, sun-drenched Sunday at Lake Sammamish State Park. The park was crowded with families and friends, a perfect picture of summer innocence. There, Ted Bundy, wearing a fake cast on his arm, began to hunt. He approached multiple women, politely asking for help loading a sailboat onto his tan Beetle. He was refused again and again, but he was patient. Finally, a kind-hearted woman named Janice O'Teedy agreed to help. She walked with him towards the parking lot. She was never seen alive again. The audacity is stunning, but what came next is almost unbelievable. Just 4 hours later, in the same park, he approached another young woman, Denise Nasland, with the same story. She, too, vanished to women, abducted in broad daylight from the same crowded park. It was an act of such audacious contempt. It was a predator showing the world he was untouchable. But while the region panicked, one woman's fear was becoming sickeningly specific. In her home, Elizabeth Klopfer read the news reports and felt a cold dread creep into her heart. The description of the man named Ted, the 10VW bug, the talk of a gas station, all sounded terrifyingly familiar. She started noticing things, items that on their own were strange, but together formed a horrifying picture. A bag of plaster of Paris in his desk, a pair of crutches he couldn't explain, surgical gloves, a meat cleaver. She even confronted him about his anger when she considered cutting her long, dark hair that looked just like the victims in the papers. In the fall of 1974, her suspicion turned to terror. She picked up the phone and called the Seattle police, her voice trembling as she gave them the name of the man she loved, Ted Bundy. But her tip, like others, was one of thousands, and it got lost in the chaos. The Phantom continued his hunt that fall. Bundy moved to Utah to attend law school, and the disappearances moved with him. Just as police in Washington were beginning to suspect a single killer was at work, their prime suspect had vanished, and a new wave of terror began hundreds of miles away. The trail of terror now stretched across state lines to Colorado and Idaho. Melissa Smith, the 17-year-old daughter of a police chief, vanished. Then Laura Aim, then Deborah Kent. The pattern was the same. The results were just as tragic, but the mask was beginning to crack. On August 16, 1975, Utah Highway Patrolman Bob Hayward noticed a VW Beetle driving erratically in the early morning hours. He pulled it over. Behind the wheel was a smooth, confident Ted Bundy. But the officer's suspicion grew when he shined his flashlight inside and noticed the car's passenger seat was gone. The search revealed what could only be described as a murder kit: a ski mask, handcuffs, rope, a crowbar, an ice pick. This should have been the end, but Bundy's charm was still potent. He was arrested but released. It was then that investigators, armed with this new concrete evidence, went back to Liz Klopfer also spoke to a young woman who had survived. Her name was Carol Derringe. She told a harrowing story of a man pretending to be Officer Rosland who lured her into his car, only to try and handcuff her. She fought for her life, a desperate, violent struggle in the front seat of his car, and miraculously escaped in a police lineup. She looked at the row of men, and her finger pointed directly at one face. Her voice, shaking but certain, Ted Bundy hairs found in his car matched 3 victims. In March 1976, he was convicted of the kidnapping of Carol Derringe and sent to prison. For many, it was a relief. The handsome monster was behind bars, but they had all underestimated his capacity for audacity. In 1977, while in Aspen, Colorado, awaiting trial for murder, Bundy, acting as his own lawyer, was given access to the courthouse library. During a recess, he asked the guard to open a window for some fresh air. He paid, and then he simply jumped. He leaped from the second-story window and ran, disappearing into the mountains. He was recaptured 8 days later, but he was already planning his next escape. This time, it would be far more meticulous. Over months, he starved himself, losing over 30 pounds night after night. He used a smuggled hacksaw blade to slowly cut a hole in the ceiling of his cell. On December 30th, 1977, he squeezed his emaciated frame through the hole, dropped into the jailer's apartment above, put on stolen clothes, and walked out the front door. It took 15 agonizing hours for anyone to realize he was gone. A ghost was in the wind once more, and this time he was heading east to Florida, free, anonymous, and completely unmoored from any semblance of control. The monster was now fully unleashed. In the early morning hours of January 15th, 1978, he broke into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. In a 15-minute hurricane of violence, he bludgeoned for women, killing Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy. In his blind rage, however, he made a fatal error on Lisa Levy's body. He left a deep, savage bite mark and impression of his own crooked teeth that was as unique as a fingerprint. Fleeing the sorority, he broke into another nearby apartment and attacked another student, Cheryl Thomas, leaving her with permanent injuries. Weeks later, his spree reached its tragic and sickening conclusion. Claudia, he abducted 12-year-old Kimberly Leach as she left her junior high school. The murder of a child was a final, horrifying line crossed, but his time was finally up. On February 15th, an officer in Pensacola, David Lee, spotted a stolen vehicle and pulled it over. The driver was Ted Bundy. He fought, kicking and running, but was quickly subdued. His reign of terror, which had crossed a nation and claimed dozens of lives, ended not with a bang, but with a scuffle on the side of a Florida road when police finally confirmed his identity. A wave of relief washed over the country. The charming monster had finally been caged. The capture of Ted Bundy felt like an ending. The trials, the convictions, the death sentences, they were meant to close the book on a national nightmare. For years, investigators worked tirelessly to map out the geography of his reign of terror. To put names to the victims and dates to the crimes, the public was given a story with a beginning, a middle, and a definitive end, but that story was a lie. Not because the facts were wrong, but because they were tragically, horrifyingly incomplete. The truth is, the Ted Bundy the world knows is merely a silhouette. The real monster remains a ghost, his true history buried in the wilderness, lost in the fog of time, and locked behind a final, chilling silence, peeling back the mask of sanity revealed. A predator, but peeling back the layer of his known crimes reveals something far more terrifying. A bottomless abyss. The first crack in the official narrative is the number. Bundy played a twisted game of confession, a master puppeteer, trading information for time, bartering with the lives he had stolen. He officially admitted to 30 murders to the public. The number was staggering. To the detectives who had chased him, it felt hollow, like a carefully curated performance. They would sit across from him, these hardened investigators from a half-dozen states, and he would hold court. He would offer a detail about a victim in Washington, a tantalizing clue that sent a wave of hope through one detective, Cade, only to pivot and dangle a half-truth about a crime in Idaho, playing them off one another. This created an investigative maze of contradiction. He would give a precise location for remains, but the description of the victim wouldn't match any missing persons file from that area for 100 miles. Was he misremembering, his mind a chaotic library of horrors? Or was he deliberately combining details from different crimes, a sadistic game to prove he was still in control? This conflict between his seemingly candid confessions and the frustrating lack of corroborating evidence stalled any hope of building a definitive victim list. For every case his information helped close, it seemed he hinted at 2 more that would forever remain open. The mystery of the final count isn't just a statistical question. It's a vast, uncounted human cost, a testament to a killer who was still managing his own dark legacy from behind bars. If the map of his crimes is an incomplete puzzle, the timeline is even more suspect. The official story says Bundy's murderous rampage began around 1974. But for the investigators on the ground, this presented a maddening contradiction. The crimes were too polished, the killer was too confident. The abduction of 2 women from a crowded park in broad daylight was not the work of a novice testing his limits. This was the work of a seasoned predator who understood how to exploit social trust, how to move without being noticed, and how to leave behind almost nothing. This mismatch between the sophistication of the crimes and the supposed start date created a critical stall in the early investigation. Were they looking for a beginner who got lucky, or an experienced killer who had, until now, been a ghost? The Ted Bundy of 1974 was not a beginner. He was a veteran. His real reign of terror likely began much, much earlier, during the lost years of his adolescence. The most haunting whisper from this period comes from Tacoma, Washington, in 1961. An 8-year-old girl named Anne Marie Burr vanished from her own bedroom in the middle of the night. few blocks away from the Burr home in 1961 was a quiet, awkward 14-year-old boy named Ted Bundy. Anne Marie's father even recalled seeing the boy lurking in the neighborhood. It was a tantalizing but circumstantial link. A ghost from a past case that threatened to completely rewrite their understanding of when the monster was born. Spree of 1974 wasn't a beginning, it was a graduation. Yet, of all the mysteries that surround him, one stands apart as the most profoundly unsettling. It comes from the man himself, in a moment of what seemed like chilling candor. By 1987, on death row, Bundy had confessed to dozens of murders. He had described horrific acts in cold, clinical detail, seemingly enjoying the notoriety. It seemed there was no corner of his depraved mind left to explore, but he was still holding something back. He admitted to a detective that there were certain murders he would never, ever talk about. This wasn't a game to buy more time. This was a boundary. Why? In his own words, these secret murders were too close to home, too close to family, or involved victims who were very young. Take a moment to process the sheer horror of that statement. This is a man who admitted to butchering dozens of boss women, a man who murdered a 12-year-old girl. What acts could possibly be so horrific, so personally significant, that even Ted Bundy refused to give them a voice? The contradiction was stunning. A narcissist who reveled in his own infamy, who used his crimes as currency, suddenly drew a line in the sand. Lee's admission stalled the entire effort to understand the man himself. It proved that the cooperative killer on death row was still wearing a mask, and that everything he had told them was likely a curated story. He gave them the murders that fit his preferred narrative, the handsome predator hunting strangers. But what of these other victims? Did they know him? Were they friends of his family? Was Anne Marie Burr one of them? The statement forces us to reconsider everything. The monster who projected a mask of sanity to the world was also projecting a sanitized version of his own evil. The full truth died with him. The man they executed on January 24th, 1989, was the author of a story whose most terrifying chapters were ripped out and burned before anyone could read them. We are left with only the outline of a monster, a chilling sketch of a man defined more by what we don't know than by what we do. If we can't even map the boundaries of his actions, how can we ever hope to understand the man who committed them? To move past the horror of Ted Bundy's actions is to confront a set of even more disturbing questions. It's not enough to know what he did. The chilling legacy of his case demands we try to understand how it was possible. How does a man like this operate in plain sight, not for days or weeks, but for years? What twisted logic fuels such depravity? And what does our own, often contradictory reaction to him say about us as a society? To answer this, we must dissect the phenomenon of Ted Bundy, not just as a criminal, but as a perfect storm of a deeply disordered mind, society's exploitable blind spots, and a legal system unprepared for the monster at its door. The first part of the puzzle is understanding that Bundy's greatest weapon was never a crowbar or a rope. It was our own perception. He was the living, breathing antithesis of the 1970s boogeyman in an era when serial killers were imagined as socially inept, visibly disturbed loners lurking in the shadows. Bundy was a creature of the light. He was handsome, articulate, and educated. He wore turtlenecks and drove a Volkswagen. He volunteered for the Republican Party and worked at a suicide crisis hotline. He didn't just blend in, he stood out as a model citizen. This is the very definition of the clinical concept known as the mask of sanity, the ability of a profoundly psychopathic, conditioned individual not just to mimic normalcy, but to project an image of idealized virtue. This mask was so flawless that it had a devastating community impact. The terror he unleashed wasn't just a fear of a nameless monster. It was the profound betrayal of realizing the monster had been invited into their homes, had worked in their offices, and had shaken their hands at political rallies. It irrevocably shattered a fundamental social contract, leaving a permanent scar on the psyche of the Pacific Northwest and beyond. Suddenly, the friendly neighbor, the helpful stranger, the charming student hall became potential threats. The open-door culture of a more trusting time slammed shut, locked tight by the paranoia he had single-handedly sown. His methods were a brutal assault on the very fabric of social grace, particularly exploiting the gender dynamics of the era. His victims were not foolish or naive, according to the social scripts that taught women to be kind, polite, and helpful. When a handsome man with his arm in a sling asked for help carrying his books, their instinct was to assist. Bundy weaponized their compassion against them, turning the rules of civility into the mechanics of a trap. Each murder was not just the taking of a life. It was a punishment for the simple act of being good. This societal blind spot extended deep into the legal system itself. Perhaps the most stunning example of the mask's power came from Judge Edward Coward. After sentencing Bundy to death, the judge famously remarked, "It's a tragedy for this court to see such a total waste of humanity. You're a bright young man. You'd have made a good lawyer. You went another way, partner." These words, spoken from the bench, are shocking, not just for their sympathy, but for what they reveal about systemic bias. A well-spoken, educated man from a good background simply did not fit the criminal profile, even in the face of incontrovertible evidence of his barbarism. The judge, a pillar of the legal establishment, was still able to see and mourn the loss of the promising young man Bundy pretended to be. It was a clear sign of a system grieving the fall of one of its own. Respectability bias that likely helped Bundy evade suspicion for far too long. He didn't just fool people, he preyed on their fundamental belief that goodness and evil are things that can be easily seen. If the mask explains how he operated externally, the far more difficult question is what was happening internally. What was the why? For years, Bundy himself offered a litany of manipulative, self-serving answers. His most famous performance came in his final days, when he blamed his actions on an addiction to violent pornography. This was not a genuine confession. It was the brilliant final act of manipulation. He was tapping into a rising social panic of the 1980s, offering a simple external scapegoat for his internal emptiness. He knew society craved a simple cause for such complex horror, and he served one up on a silver platter. It was a reflection of our own societal need to find easy answers, to blame a corrupting influence rather than accept the terrifying possibility that some people are simply born broken. He later admitted to FBI profiler Bill Agmeyer that the pornography claim was a lie, a convenient excuse. The truth is, there was no simple reason. Retrospective analysis by mental health experts points to a constellation of severe personality disorders, primarily narcissistic personality disorder, and, most importantly, antisocial personality disorder, more commonly known as psychopathy. Bundy was not crazy in the sense of being out of touch with reality. As he told Hagmeyer, they knew damn well I wasn't crazy. Psychopathy is not a break from reality. It is a fundamental lack of the emotional hardware that makes us human. It is a void where empathy, guilt, and remorse should be. When scientists studied his brain after his execution, they found no tumors, no physical abnormalities. The flaw wasn't in his brain structure, it was in its very wiring. This reality poses an immense challenge to a legal system built on human concepts. How can a system based on deterrence, motive, and remorse effectively process a man who feels no guilt and fears no real consequence beyond capture? He saw his trial not as a reckoning, but as a stage for his grandest performance. The search for a complex, tragic motiva, history of abuse, turning a good man baddies, ultimately a futile exercise that he himself encouraged. The most terrifying answer to why is also the simplest, and it came from Bundy himself when a corrections officer, tired of all the psychological theories, asked him directly why he killed all those women. Bundy gave a calm, 5-word confession that cuts through all the noise. I liked it. There was no deeper meaning. He was a predator who enjoyed the power, the control, the hunt, and the kill. The why is not a puzzle to be solved. It is a void to be acknowledged. Finally, Bundy's case forces us to turn the analytical lens on ourselves. His trial for the Chi Omega murders was the first to be nationally televised, and it transformed a legal proceeding into a macabre media spectacle. It was a watershed moment that blurred the lines between justice and entertainment, turning Bundy into the first reality TV villain. This gave rise to a deeply disturbing phenomenon, Bundy mania. Women flocked to the courtroom to catch a glimpse of him. They wrote him thousands of love letters and even proposed marriage. This attraction to dangerous criminals, known as hyperstophilia, was on full public display for the families of the victims and the communities he terrorized. This hero worship was a profound secondary assault. It demonstrated a bizarre schism in the public consciousness, where one part of society grieved while another was enthralled. This spectacle was the birth of the modern true crime celebrity. Bundy created the template for the charming, intelligent killer archetype that remains a staple of pop culture. His case forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about our own consumption of these stories. In our endless fascination, do we risk mythologizing the perpetrator at the expense of the victims? Do we inadvertently continue the work of the media spectacle that began in that Florida courtroom, turning a brutal predator into a complex anti-hero? Bundy was a monster, but the stage that made him a superstar was one we, as a society, built for him and continue to rebuild for others like him. On the morning of January 24th, 1989, a strange and unsettling carnival unfolded outside the walls of Florida State Prison. As the state prepared to execute Ted Bundy, thousands of people gathered in the pre-dawn chill. This was not a somber vigil. It was a tailgate party for a public exorcism. When the official announcement of his death came, a roar erupted from the crowd. People cheered, danced, and set off fireworks, the explosions momentarily lighting up the dark sky. They wore t-shirts with his face on them and chanted, "Burn, Bundy, burn." Local bars held celebratory parties, and one radio DJ reportedly broadcast the sound of bacon sizzling on a skillet. It was a visceral, cathartic release of a nation's collective fear and rage. For a brief, celebratory moment, it felt like justice. It felt like an ending. It felt like the monster had finally been vanquished inside the prison. The end was far quieter. Ted Bundy, the man who had orchestrated so much chaos and terror, met his fate in sterile silence, punctuated only by the hum of the electric chair. His last words were not a confession, not a plea for forgiveness, not a final, defiant roar. They were a simple, mundane request. "I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." It was a final, hollow performance of normalcy from a man who was anything but. The contrast was staggering. Outside, a public spectacle of retribution. Inside, the quiet, almost pathetic end of a man who was, in his final moments, just a name on a list. But to focus on the death of the monster is to risk making the final mistake, making the story about him the true, lasting legacy of Ted Bundy is not the story of his life or even the spectacle of his death. It is the vast, silent void left behind by the women whose lives he stole. They were not just names on a list or faces on a missing poster. They were students with dog-eared textbooks and dreams of the future. They were daughters on the phone with their parents, sisters, friends, and adventurers. They were Linda Ann Healy, Georgianne Hawkins, Donna Manson, Susan Roncourt, Deborah Kent, Lisa Levy, Margaret Bowman, and dozens, perhaps 100 more. They were women who made the simple human mistake of trusting a handsome face, of offering help to a man who feigned injury, of believing in the fundamental goodness of a stranger. The roar of the crowd on that January morning has long since faded. The fireworks are gone, but the silence left by their stolen futures is permanent. That is the weight that remains. Did the execution of Ted Bundy truly deliver? justice. It delivered punishment. Certainly, it brought a form of closure to a terrified public, but it did not deliver the whole truth. It did not answer the most haunting questions he left behind. How many women did he really kill? Where are their bodies? When did the killing truly start? And who were the victims of the murders he deemed too close to home? The ones so terrible that even he refused to speak their names. Killing the man did not kill the mysteries. He took those answers with him, leaving behind a legacy of unresolved pain and unanswered questions. Justice was served, but a complete truth may forever be out of reach in the end. Perhaps Bundy's most significant role was that of a teacher. He taught us a lesson we remain desperate to unlearn, that evil does not always advertise itself. It does not always come in a monstrous form. It can come with a charming smile, a law degree, and a kind word. It can be the man who helps you with your books, the one who counsels you on a crisis hotline, the one who looks just like a beloved son or a trusted husband. He shattered our comforting stereotypes and forced us to confront the reality that the most dangerous predators are often the ones who are masters of blending in. He is gone, but his final prophecy, his most chilling piece of analysis, remains in his last hours. He looked a detective in the eye and delivered his own epitaph, a warning that echoes to this day. We serial killers are your sons. We are your husbands. We are everywhere. And there will be more of your children dead tomorrow. He wasn't just being grandiose. He was explaining himself and the terrifying truth of the world he inhabited. He was telling us that he was not an aberration, but an archetype. His execution didn't destroy the monster. It only destroyed one of its masks, and his final, chilling legacy is the question he forces us all to ask as we look at the familiar faces in our own lives, in our own homes. How many other masks are out there, smiling back at us right now?